No one expects fear to grow inside a famous home. No one imagines that behind success, laughter, and Hollywood lights, a quiet terror can live for decades without ever being named. Long before the world knew anything was wrong, a young girl learned how to listen to silence. She learned how to read a room the moment a door opened, how to feel danger before a word was spoken, and how to stay quiet, not because she was weak, but because she was trying to protect the people she loved most. That girl was Roi Reiner, daughter of legendary filmmaker Rob Reiner and his wife, Michelle Reiner. From the outside, the Reiner family looked untouchable. Fame, stability, a loving household admired by friends and colleagues alike. But inside those walls, something else was growing. A fear that had a name, and that name was Nick Reiner. It didn't begin with violence. It didn't begin with shouting. It began with small moments that didn't feel right. As a child, Roy couldn't explain why her body tensed whenever Nick was nearby, why her heartbeat changed when he invited her outside, why ordinary situations felt suddenly unsafe. Nick's moods could shift without warning, one moment calm, the next unsettling. There were times when his words didn't match his eyes, times when his tone stayed soft, but something underneath it felt wrong. And as the years passed, that unease deepened. Roy watched her parents stand firmly by their son. They believed in him. They hoped for recovery. They gave everything they had to help him through his struggles. Seeing that devotion, Roy made a choice no child should ever have to make. She buried her fear. She convinced herself that silence was love, that speaking up would only hurt her parents. That, enduring quietly, was the price of keeping the family together. So she stayed quiet, even when she felt unsafe, even when her instincts screamed, even when fear became something she carried every single day. And that silence would shape everything that came next. Fear doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it teaches you lessons quietly. Roy learned early that safety inside her own home was never guaranteed. She learned how to measure every word, how to slow her movements, how to disappear emotionally while still being physically present. When Nick entered a room, the air changed. Nothing dramatic had to happen. Sometimes it was just a look, sometimes a silence that felt too heavy, sometimes a calm voice saying something that sounded harmless but wasn't. As a child, Roy didn't have language for what she felt. She only knew that her body reacted before her mind could catch up. Her shoulders tightened, her stomach dropped. Her instincts told her to stay alert. There were afternoons she remembered vividly. Nick would call her outside, sounding friendly, almost playful, but his eyes told a different story. He talked casually about animals, about watching how long they could endure. The way he spoke was calm, too calm. Roy didn't understand the meaning behind his words, but she understood the warning. She froze, searching for a way out that wouldn't provoke him. When she whispered that she didn't like it, Nick laughed. Her fear amused him. What stayed with her wasn't just what he did. It was what he said. Quiet sentences, dropped casually. Sentences that carried weight without volume. If I wanted to, he once said calmly, I could take everything out of control. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten openly. But Roy felt the message. From that moment on, silence became her shield. As they grew older, the fear didn't disappear. It evolved. Nick began pulling her closer emotionally, telling her she was the only one who understood him, that she was the only one on his side, that they were the same, those words made her feel chosen and trapped. His invitations became more persistent, subtle pressure wrapped in familiarity, presented as bonding. But to Roy, it felt like a tightening a snare. She learned something crucial during those years. Nick's anger could surface instantly. A careless comment, a pause, even silence itself. His voice would drop, his eyes would harden, and Roy knew she had to retreat immediately. "Don't make me angry," he once said. Not loudly, just clearly enough. Her sense of safety became fragile, like glass that could shatter at any moment. There were times when Nick completely lost control, shouting, waving his arms, exploding over small disagreements. Roy curled inward instinctively, protecting herself without even realizing she was doing it. She learned how to move through her own home like someone crossing broken glass. Every step calculated, every reaction controlled. This wasn't weakness, it was survival. And the hardest part wasn't the fear itself. It was knowing she couldn't tell her parents everything. She saw how exhausted they already were. Years spent trying to help their son. Years of hope, followed by setbacks. They loved him fiercely, unconditionally. So Roy carried the fear alone. She believed that love meant endurance, that protecting her parents meant staying silent, that the speaking up would only cause more pain. And for years, she kept that promise, even as the fear followed her everywhere. As the years passed, the fear didn't fade. It simply learned how to hide better. Living under the same roof meant living in constant alert mode. Roy learned to listen for footsteps, to read the mood before a word was spoken, to know where the safest corner of the room was at all times. She avoided being alone with him, avoided confrontation, avoided saying anything that could be misunderstood. Every movement became intentional, every reaction carefully chosen. There were moments when even a small accidents sent her into panic, dropping an object, reacting too slowly, laughing at the wrong time. Her heart would race instantly. Her body would tense. Fear would take over before logic could intervene. She learned how to disappear without leaving, how to make herself smaller, how to exist without drawing attention. And yet, Nick's presence dominated the space no matter how quiet he was. Sometimes he would remain silent for long stretches, almost invisible. Then, without warning, something would shift. A look would harden, a tone would change, and the entire house would tighten. Roy watched her parents during these moments. They never turned away from their son. They never abandoned him. Instead, they absorbed the tension themselves. She saw exhaustion settle into their faces, saw how deeply they worried, saw how hard they worked to keep everything from falling apart. They searched for doctors, specialists, treatment programs. They reshaped their lives around one goal, keeping their son alive. Sometimes when Nick showed signs of improvement, hope filled the house. The air felt lighter. Conversations lasted longer. Laughter returned briefly. But when setbacks came, the weight returned instantly. Roy understood something painful at a very young age. Love didn't always mean safety. From the outside, the family still looked perfect. A famous father, a devoted mother, a beautiful home. But behind closed doors, everyone walked on thin ice. Roy watched her parents endure moments no one should have to face. Shouting, accusations, outbursts that left the room shaken. They didn't yell back. They didn't escalate. They stood there, absorbing the storm. And Roy understood that they were doing it for her, shielding her from the worst of it, carrying the burden themselves. That realization only deepened her silence, because how could she add her fear to their exhaustion? So she stayed alert, she stayed quiet, she survived. And in those rare periods when Nick wasn't around, something changed. The house breathed. For the first time in years, Roi could relax without bracing herself. She slept better, spoke more freely, laughed without fear of triggering something unseen. Dinner felt normal, conversations flowed. The tension eased just enough. She didn't celebrate his absence, she felt guilty for the relief, but she couldn't ignore the truth. When he wasn't there, she could finally breathe. The years when Nick drifted away from the house were the only times Roi felt something close to peace. Not happiness, not freedom, rest. For the first time in a long while, she didn't wake up bracing herself. She didn't flinch at sudden sounds. She didn't measure every word before speaking. She could sit at the dinner table and talk about ordinary things, work, daily frustrations, small moments that once felt too risky to share. Her parents noticed the change immediately. Roi slept better. She spoke more. She laughed without stopping herself. Michelle once looked at her carefully and asked, almost cautiously, if she was okay. Roi nodded. She didn't say more, because even relief came with guilt. Nick's absence didn't mean things were better. It meant things were quieter. It meant her body finally had room to relax after years of tension. And that truth felt shameful. One evening, Nick called from far away. His voice came through a speaker, familiar and distant. Roi noticed something shocking. She didn't freeze. Her heart didn't race. Her hands didn't shake. When the call ended, she exhaled and said quietly, almost without thinking, that at least he wasn't there. The words hung in the air. No one corrected her. No one argued. There was only silence, heavy, understanding silence. Even those close to the family had sensed it for years. The fear wasn't imagined. It wasn't exaggerated. Nick's presence unsettled people, friends, guests, even adults who had no reason to be afraid. Jake, her older brother, later admitted that he used to lock his bedroom door. When Nick was around, especially during his worst periods, being alone felt unsafe. There were nights of shouting, of smashed objects, of sudden explosions that left everyone shaken. That fear never fully faded. Family friends recalled gatherings that turned tense the moment Nick arrived. Voices lowered, laughter stopped. People watched carefully, searching for exits without realizing they were doing it. Even professionals who worked with him noticed the volatility. Outbursts, threats, moments that spiraled without warning. It was the same pattern everywhere, unpredictable, unsettling, exhausting. And through all of it, Rob and Michelle never turned away. They stayed. They endured. They kept believing that love, patience, and proximity could save their son. Rob once admitted quietly that all they wanted was for their son to stay alive. That sentence explained everything. They weren't blind. They weren't naive. They were terrified parents holding on to hope. And Roi understood that, which made what came next even harder. Because when Nick moved back onto the property, everything changed. The fear she had learned to manage from a distance came rushing back, sharper, closer, unavoidable. Just knowing he was there, behind the door, across the garden, made her chest tighten. This wasn't a reunion, it felt like a warning. And for the first time, Roi couldn't ignore what her instincts were telling her. She didn't feel safe. When Nick moved back onto the property, even though he wasn't inside the main house, Roi felt the shift immediately. Distance had once softened the fear. Proximity erased it completely. Knowing he was nearby, just steps away, behind walls, behind doors, made her chest tighten every single day. Sleep became difficult again. Her body returned to constant alert mode. This wasn't imagination. This was memory responding to threat. She whispered something she had never said out loud before. "I don't feel safe." The words came quietly, as if speaking them too loudly might make something irreversible happen. That fear is what pushed her to leave. Moving out wasn't rebellion. It wasn't punishment. It wasn't a statement. It was survival. She needed distance to breathe, to sleep, to stop living as if something terrible could happen at any moment. Jake understood immediately. He didn't argue. He didn't question her instincts. He didn't minimize what she was feeling. He said one sentence that meant everything. "I know you need this." Together, Roy and Jake tried to warn their parents carefully. They didn't accuse, they didn't demand. Every word was measured, softened, restrained. Nick wasn't okay, at least not okay to be this close. Roy's fear was clear. Even when her words failed her, her expression said everything she couldn't say out loud, but Rob and Michelle saw things differently. To them, keeping Nick close was love. It was protection. It was the only way to prevent him from slipping further away. If he stayed within reach, they believed they could guide him, intervene, keep him safe. Michelle once explained that if family didn't protect him, then who would? That difference in perspective created a quiet fracture. No shouting, no dramatic confrontation, just a divide between hope and instinct. Rob and Michelle were guided by love and belief. Roy was guided by years of fear she had never been allowed to name. She tried to explain herself, but the words always caught in her throat. She was terrified of hurting her parents, afraid of being seen as cold, afraid of becoming the daughter who pushed her own brother away. So she said only what she could manage, that she didn't feel okay, that she needed space, that she couldn't live like this anymore. Everything else stayed locked inside. Jake stood in the middle, quietly protecting his sister, avoiding a direct clash with their parents. Rob once said something that sounded less like a plan and more like a prayer. "If we keep him close enough, we won't lose him." Even then, Roy never turned her back on Nick. She answered his calls. She helped when she could. She showed up when her parents were overwhelmed. At one point, she even called him her best friend. That contradiction is what makes everything so painful, because all of this happened before that final day, before the police arrived, before the house in Brentwood changed forever, before silence finally broke. December 14th began like any other ordinary day. There was no warning, no strange feeling in the air, no moment that signaled the end of everything she had known. Roy walked into her parents' home expecting nothing more than routine, the familiar quiet, the comfort she still felt whenever she was with them. Instead, she found something her mind refused to process. Rob and Michelle were lying still, unresponsive, silent in a way that felt unreal. There was no dramatic scream, no collapse, just a numbness that spread through her body like ice. Time seemed to freeze. Sound disappeared. Her thoughts scattered, unable to form meaning. It was their daughter who found them, not a neighbor, not a caregiver, her. Before the world knew, before the house filled with sirens and the strangers, before reality closed in, Roy called the police. Those close to her later described her voice as calm in a way that broke their hearts. It trembled slightly, but it didn't crack. She gave the address. She described what she saw. She said her parents were gone. When the call ended, the house fell into a silence she had feared for years, but never imagined would come like this. When officers arrived, Roy looked directly at them and said a sentence that would stay with her forever. "My brother Nick, I think you should look into him." It was the most painful thing she had ever said. She didn't want to say it, but she couldn't not say it. Those words didn't come from shock. They didn't come from panic. They came from years of watching, years of fear, years of instincts buried for the sake of love. In that moment, everything she had suppressed aligned into one devastating realization. After she spoke, Roy collapsed emotionally. She didn't just lose her parents that day, she lost the family as she had always known it. Jake arrived soon after. He didn't ask why, he didn't demand explanations, he already understood. He wrapped his arms around his sister and held her tightly. "You did the only thing you could," he told her, but no words could soften the truth. She had crossed a line no one ever wants to face, placing her own brother under suspicion in the loss of their parents. And even after Nick was taken into a custody, the fear didn't disappear. It sharpened. In the days that followed, Roy still didn't feel safe. Locked doors felt temporary, like fragile pauses between nightmares. She whispered the same fear again and again. "If he ever gets out, I don't think I'll survive." This wasn't passing panic, it was fear built over decades and violently awakened by tragedy. And that was only the beginning of what she would have to live with next. After that day, nothing felt real anymore. Roy didn't just lose her parents, she lost the last place where she had ever felt protected. The images never left her, not at night, not during the day. Sleep became fractured, shallow, interrupted by terror she couldn't control. Sometimes she woke up shaking, heart racing, convinced she heard footsteps that weren't there. Other times she is startled at the smallest sound, a door closing, a phone vibrating, a voice raised slightly too loud. Her body never fully relaxed. People close to her said she broke down without warning. Tears came suddenly without explanation. At other times, she felt nothing at all. Numbness replaced feeling. Silence replaced safety. She was diagnosed with severe post-traumatic stress. The trauma didn't come from one single moment. It was the result of years layered with fear, silence, and endurance, all shattered by irreversible loss. Through all of it, Jake stayed close. He became her anchor. She clung to him, terrified of being alone with her thoughts. She begged him not to leave her side. "If I'm alone, I can't control my thoughts," she admitted. Jake didn't ask questions. He already knew the weight she had carried for most of her life. Now that weight had nowhere left to hide. What hurt the most wasn't only grief. It was the feeling that she had crossed a point of no return. Reporting her brother, even out of truth and self-preservation, became a wound she replayed endlessly in her mind. "I know I did the right thing," she admitted, "but I can't stop thinking he'll never forgive me." That thought followed her everywhere. She changed her routines, avoided crowded places, constantly scanned exits in every room she entered. Safety became relative, not something that existed in the present, but something that could be taken away at any moment. Those close to her insist she isn't paranoid. She's trapped in memories that refuse to quiet down. Nick may be behind bars, but in Roy's mind, his presence still lingers, like a long, cold shadow that never fully disappears. Justice moving forward didn't bring peace. It brought a space. And in that space, Roy began navigating something even harder than fear, living with the truth. What Roy lives with now isn't just grief, it's the unbearable weight of knowing that silence shaped everything. For years, she adapted, she avoided, she endured. She learned how to survive inside a home where love and fear existed side by side, where protection meant staying quiet, where instincts were buried for the sake of family. When she finally spoke her fear out loud, it wasn't an accusation made in anger. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't betrayal. It was a truth that had waited decades to breathe. Roy wasn't just a witness to a devastating outcome. She was someone who had lived with unease long before it had a name, long before the world paid attention, long before tragedy forced everything into the open. She had learned how to read danger, how to retreat, how to hold herself together while protecting the people she loved. And now, for the first time, she no longer has to do that. But this release doesn't look like peace. It looks like emptiness, confusion, disorientation. The foundation of her life was ripped away without warning. The safety she once tried so desperately to preserve is gone. What remains is grief, and the haunting question that refuses to disappear. If fear had been spoken sooner, could this tragedy have been prevented? Or are some families destined to pay for silence with suffering? Roy's story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes love asks too much. Sometimes protection turns into endurance. And sometimes surviving means carrying a burden no one should ever have to bear. She did what she believed was right, but doing the right thing came at a cost that will follow her forever. And that is the deepest tragedy of all.